So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about a serial killer named the Man in Black. But before I even say anything else, some of you might have noticed that on the last video I uploaded, I started replying to a bunch of comments and talking to you all in the comment section. And I really enjoyed doing that. I don't know why I don't do that more. So from now on, I'm going to start doing that on every single video. As soon as the video goes live, I'm going to be down in the comment section replying to all your comments and hearting all your comments. So for today's video, I want a little bit of like a Q&A going on in the comment section. So if you have any questions for me or any questions about this case or any questions about any other case that I might have covered, put them down in the comments below and we'll have a bit more of a chat than we normally do. I always read the comments and I always heart a bunch of comments every time I upload a video, but I just never really sit and talk and reply to comments, and I need to start doing that more. That's really bad that I don't do that. So go put something down in the comments below now, so I'm going to be on the video now, go. But yeah, before we get into this case, I just want to thank our sponsors NordVPN for sponsoring this video. NordVPN is of course a VPN service that allows you to stay protected while browsing the internet. I personally use a VPN and I have done for many years now because in my personal life and in my work life, I access a lot of dodgy websites. That sounds bad, but some of the websites that I go on to find out things about these crimes can't be trusted. A VPN basically stops hackers from being able to view and access your information by giving you a different IP address, and that VPN basically acts like a barrier between hackers and people trying to access your information and you. I really do recommend using a VPN if you use public Wi-Fi a lot, so like libraries, hotels, coffee shops, McDonald's, whatever. You never know who's on that Wi-Fi network and you never know how secure it is. VPNs are also super useful to access content from outside of your country. So like sometimes when you're on YouTube and a video is blocked in your country, you can use an IP address from a different country and access that video. I use it a lot for Netflix. So the UK Netflix is kind of rubbish, whereas the US Netflix has everything. You guys are so lucky. I always use a VPN in America somewhere to go on Netflix, and then you get access to all the American Netflix shows like The Office US. Personal favourite of mine. And NordVPN have been kind enough to give you guys 1 month free, and not only that, 70% off of your subscription, making it just $3.49 a month if you go through my link nordvpn.com/Eleanor and use the code Eleanor at checkout. That is an insane amount of money. $3.49 a month. That is the price of one coffee, and if that means that your information is protected online, to me, that's priceless. But yeah, thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. If you do want that insane deal, make sure you're going through the link nordvpn.com/Eleanor and using the code Eleanor at checkout. That is the only way you will get that deal. Now, like I said at the beginning, today we're going to be talking about a UK serial killer nicknamed the Man in Black. But before we do, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to talk about is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So this case begins in September of 1995 in Anglesey, which is a little island just off the north coast of Wales. Henry Roberts was a 56-year-old retired railway worker, and he didn't really have many friends, he didn't have any family left, and he only really spent his time either at home alone or at the pub. His mother passed away when he was in his late 40s, and up until that point it had literally just been Henry and his mother in this house all his life. And so suddenly, in his late 40s, his only friend and only remaining family member has passed away, and he is left alone in this house. There were a lot of changes going on in his life. And while I can't really comment on his mental health and his mental state since I don't know him, it really did seem to take a toll on him, and he seemed to begin spiralling. He retired from his job early, he stopped looking after the house. The house was so run down and broken. Whenever anything would break or need a touch up or fix up or anything, he just wouldn't. So he was living in a very ramshackled cottage. He started going to the pub every single day just for some social interaction, some human contact, And that in turn turned him into an alcoholic because he would drink every single time he went to the pub. Some nights when he was in the pub, he would spend in excess of £100 on just alcohol, and he really was deteriorating in front of everyone's eyes. No one in the pub really knew him that well, but you know, they would talk to him when he was in there, but they just didn't really care to make friends with him outside of that. And even though he was like a loner and a drunk in the 90s, those kind of people would have been looked down upon. A lot of people wouldn't want to have interacted with them, but Henry was quite well respected still. Because I think people understood his situation. They knew that it wasn't like he'd been an alcoholic all his life, he'd never even tried to get a job. Like, he had been a very hard-working man at one point in his life, but they knew that he'd been through a lot with losing his mother, losing his only friend, and that had sent him into this kind of alcoholic spiral. But yeah, like I said, he didn't really do much with his life at all. It was part of his daily routine to just wake up, sit around the house, probably watch some TV or whatever, and then go to the pub every evening. He would walk to and from the pub. It was only like a quarter of a mile away, and that was like his exercise for the day. But in late September of 1995, the regulars at the pub noticed that Henry Roberts hadn't come in for 3 days, which was very, very unlike him. Like I said, this was a daily routine every single evening. He'd never gone even one day without coming in the pub for the last few years. So a couple of the men from the pub decided to go to Henry Roberts' house and just make sure that everything was okay. They knew that he was an older guy, he lived alone, he was an alcoholic, maybe he'd fallen or injured himself and wasn't able to get up. Maybe he needed someone to go and check on him. And so these men went to his house, but what they found was way worse than what they were worried about in the first place. They walked through the gate and out into the yard close to where the cottage was, but before they even got there, they saw Henry Roberts' dead body laying just meters away from his front door, covered in blood. The men called the police, who came down to assess the situation, and immediately, of course, this was not a natural death. This was obviously murder. In his autopsy, it was found that Henry Roberts was stabbed a total of 47 times. However, an interesting thing that pathologists found was that a lot of these stab wounds were superficial. Many of them were shallow and in parts of the body that would not cause death. Like, it's morbid to say, but if you're gonna stab someone to try and kill them, you're probably gonna go for the chest area or the neck or, like, you know, organs, you know what I mean. However, a lot of the stab wounds on Roberts's body were calves and thighs and arms, his buttocks as well, like in fleshy parts of his body. Whoever was doing this was trying to prolong the murder and cause pain to Henry Roberts rather than kill him straight away. The murderer wasn't doing this to kill, they were doing it to cause pain. Killing was probably the end goal, considering they did go far enough to kill Henry Roberts. They weren't planning on leaving him alive, but that's not the only the murder is not the only reason they were doing it. Police also determined that this murder was probably sexually motivated because Henry's body was found laying face down on the ground with his pants pulled down halfway down his legs, and like I said, his buttocks was stabbed. I don't know if that's the only reason that they think it was sexually motivated. I don't know if they found anything at the scene, like semen or anything like that. However, police didn't make it public knowledge that they thought that this was a sexually motivated crime. All the reports just said murder, like a vicious murder. They talked about every other part of the murder apart from the police thought it was sexually motivated because they didn't want to scare anyone. Obviously, a murder, a very brutal, vicious murder, is scary enough as it is. However, sexually motivated killers, they're very likely to kill again because sexual gratification is something that comes and it goes. So they get sexual gratification from killing this person. However, a couple of days later, they want to do it again. It's not an urge that is ever completely fulfilled. It's something that'll come back. And so if police report that this was sexually motivated, people are gonna get really scared thinking that this person is gonna strike again. And because they didn't tell the public that this was sexually motivated, I think that's why. I can't find why they think it was sexually motivated, because I don't know if Henry Roberts or his body after death was actually sexually assaulted, or if it was just a sexually motivated crime. Because with sexually motivated murders, there's normally like 3 categories that you can put the murder in. Category number 1 being that the murder was sexually motivated, the person killed the other person, but once that person was dead, they no longer had the sexual urges. It was sexual to begin with, but then once the person dies, the murderer doesn't want to go through with the sexual acts. Category number 2 is when a sexually motivated murder occurs, person A kills person B, and again, once person B is dead, person A doesn't want to go through the sexual acts with this person, but they are still sexually aroused, and so they take care of themselves. You see that quite a bit with sexually motivated murders that were probably planned to be a rape and murder. However, the person got killed before the murderer had a chance to rape them. However, they still want sexual gratification, and so they just do it to themselves after. And category 3 is, of course, full-blown necrophilia, where the person will kill the person and then have sex with the body. Those 3 categories, by the way, are not like binary. Like, there's hundreds of thousands of outcomes from a sexually motivated murder, but those 3 are the main 3 that you see when someone kills someone but that sexual need has not been met. What does the murderer do afterwards to fulfill that sexual urge? Do they give up? Do they do it to themselves? Or do they, you know, commit necrophilia? Anyway, a huge tangent, but I was basically trying to say that I don't know which of those 3 happened in this murder with Henry Roberts. I don't know if it was category A, B or C. And category A, B and C are not technical terms, by the way, that's just how I've put it in this video to make it easier to explain. So anyway, looking for leads and potential murderers, absolutely nothing was left at this crime scene, which meant that this was going to be a very hard case to solve. There was no murder weapon, the murderer didn't drop anything, they didn't leave any clues, there was absolutely nothing. And so police decided to obviously put this case on the news and ask people to come forward if they had any information, and they only really got one useful lead. They got tons of leads, but they all kind of fizzled out eventually. But this one lead was from a guy that said he walked past Henry's house a couple of days before the murder and seen a van in his driveway. Now, Henry Roberts didn't drive, he didn't have a van, he didn't have any vehicles, and like I said, he didn't have any friends or family, so whose van was this in his house? So police began following this van lead, but again, there's no cameras in the area, so that was going to be really hard to track down, but they were trying their best. They spoke to everyone in the pub that Henry usually went in, but no one knew of anyone that might want to do this to Henry. However, he was known to collect Nazi memorabilia, although I don't know if that was like a generally known fact about Henry among the town, or if it was only like his Nazi friends that knew that. So police also kind of looked into that. However, 2 months after Henry Roberts' murder, that investigation was interrupted when a second, equally as brutal murder happened 5 miles away. Keith Randalls was a 49-year-old traffic manager living out of a caravan on a construction site. So I believe this was like a travelling job. He was just like a traffic manager to help with the traffic flow on the construction site, and he would basically live wherever this job needed him to be on site, you know what I mean? So I don't know if he had any family, but at the time of his murder, he was living alone in a caravan on the construction site. And one morning, when the construction workers came to the construction site to start their work for the day, they walked in and found Keith Randall's body stabbed to death and covered in blood, just again a few metres away from his front door, just like Henry Roberts. His co-workers called police, who came down to the scene and once again straight away knew that this was a murder, and quite a brutal one as well. It seemed that there'd been a struggle, there was a lot of like misplaced gravel on the ground, as if there'd been like a fight and there was blood trailing all over the place. Blood evidence showed that the attack had started in the doorway of the caravan, so police immediately theorised that someone, the murderer, had come and knocked on Keith's door, he'd opened the door, and immediately the attack began. The blood eventually led out into a gravel area in front of Keith's caravan, and like I said, gravel was displaced and everything. There was blood on so many different parts of this gravel area, so the fight had like moved around. Keith was really fighting for his life until eventually it seemed as though Keith had collapsed to the ground and the murderer had left him there to die. Unfortunately, once again, there was little to no evidence that police could collect from the crime scene. No weapon, nothing left by the murderer, no clues, absolutely nothing. And so they began investigating this one by trying to figure out Keith's movements from the night before. They found that Keith had actually been out at the pub that night, a local pub, and had walked home by himself that night. He stopped along the way to get some chips and then went back to his caravan on the construction site. And it seemed as though shortly after arriving home, this murderer had knocked on the door. Police spoke with Randall's friends, family, co-workers, people in the pub, and again, no one could think of anyone that might want to do this to Keith Randalls. He was generally very well liked. Very well liked, actually. He was really quite popular. He was known for doing a lot of charity work. Everyone loved Keith Randalls. He would do fundraisers and stuff with his friends where they'd do stupid stuff to like raise money for charities. They'd like dress up and I don't know the different things that they would do, but it was all for laughs and to raise money at the same time. Keith and his friends would take the elderly people from the nursing homes out on coach trips to like the seaside or the city or whatever. He was just a very kind-hearted man and everyone knew that. But Keith's favourite thing in the world was his family. His family meant everything to him. And like I said, it was around November time was his murder, and he was planning to go to his daughter's house for Christmas, and he was really, really excited. He was such a family man. So now police had two separate but very similar murders to solve. Both were middle-aged older men that had been out drinking that night. They'd walked home alone, and then after they'd got home, they were attacked probably in their doorway. So again, police appealed on the news for anyone that might know anything about this murder to come forward, and they got a very similar lead to the last one. On the night of Keith Randalls' murder, a van had been seen at the entrance to the construction site, and on a night at this construction site, all the vehicles were like put away. They wouldn't just be at the entrance to the construction site. So immediately that stuck out to police as well. So police were pretty sure that the two murders were linked. However, they never officially stated that because, again, they didn't want to scare the public and they couldn't be sure at this point because they had very limited leads. However, it wouldn't be long until they had a third murder on their hands. This time, it was about 40 miles away from the previous two murders. The last two were on an island called Anglesey. Now, this one was on the coast of North Wales on Pensarn Beach. The body was identified as that of 35-year-old father of two, Anthony Davies, better known as Tony Davies. It was the 19th of December, so very, very close to Christmas, and on this particular day, Tony Davies and his wife had been looking after Tony's elderly aunt. And with it being so close to Christmas, Tony's aunt wanted to go to the cemetery to go and see her husband's grave. And so Tony and his wife took her that day. Everything was well until they went to leave the graveyard and Tony's aunt actually fell and broke her leg as they were leaving. And so they rushed her to hospital, she was treated and everything, and Tony spent the whole day in hospital with her. She was let out that same day, so Tony took her home and everything, got her settled in bed and whatever, went home to his own family for a couple of hours, and then decided he wanted to go back and see his aunt just like one more time before bed to make sure she didn't need anything. And so he set off to go and visit her about 8 or 9 p.m. Meanwhile, his wife puts the kids to bed back at home and she decides to wait up for her husband to return. And she's waiting and she's waiting, but he's not so much as called to even let her know that he's got there. And Tony's wife understood that the aunt was injured and that she would have needed Tony, and so the wife left it as long as she possibly could, trying to be understanding of the situation, but still very concerned because this was unlike her husband. So she waited until the early hours of the morning, and then she thought, absolutely not. Like, if Tony would have stayed over there for the night, he would have at least called to let her know. She called round all of Tony's friends and family. However, because it was like 3 or 4 in the morning, a lot of them didn't answer because they were asleep. However, Tony's brother did pick up, and so they all went out. Tony's wife, Tony's brother, and I think a friend or two all went out in their cars just looking around the local area for him. However, they just couldn't find him when they were driving around, and they were only getting more and more panicked by the second, and so they decided to call the police. So a couple of officers went out driving in their cars, joining the search for him, and one of them drove past a car park on Pensarn Beach and noticed that this car park was completely empty, of course, at 3 in the morning, apart from one car in the car park. So this officer drives in the car park and notices that this car fits the exact description of Tony Davies' car. This was his car, registration plate and all. So the officer pulled in and went to go and have a look at this car, but Tony wasn't inside. However, this meant that he couldn't have gone far because he now didn't have a vehicle, so he must have been in this kind of immediate area. So this officer starts walking around the kind of beachside shops, looking in doorways to see if he's asleep, looking on benches to see if he's asleep. Like, maybe he just didn't want to go home for some reason or another. But still, there was no sign of Tony Davies in the area, and so to get a better, like, wider look at the general area, this officer jumps up onto the beach wall. Now, I don't know if they have beach walls in like other countries, so let me try and explain. So there's the sea, and then there's the sand, and then there's a beach wall right here, so that when the tide comes in, it can only go up to this wall, like, because there's houses here. They want to protect the houses. So this officer jumps up onto the beach wall, and he's looking out at the beach, and on the sand, very, very close to the sea, he sees a shape, like a bundle, and immediately his heart sinks. So the officer jumps down off this wall and starts walking down the beach towards this bundle, but as he's getting closer, he realises that it wasn't a bundle, it was a person. And this person seemed lifeless. Their head was towards the sea, their feet were towards the beach, and this officer's like shouting to this person to like get up, but they're not moving. Before the officer could even get halfway to this body, other cars begin pulling into the car park because, of course, as soon as he realised that that was Tony's car in the car park, he informed everyone else so that they could all meet up at this location because it seemed as though Tony was in that area. So cars began arriving, and this one particular car swerves into the car park. A man jumps out of the car, starts running towards the beach, and this is Tony's brother. And he's shouting to this officer to turn his torch on so that they can all see this body. And when the officer did, that was when he realised that they were looking at the dead body of his brother, Anthony Davis. And just like with the other murders, it was immediately clear that this was not a natural death, this was obviously murder. Because the tide was coming in, the officers had to move the body away from the sea. Ideally, they try not to touch a body because it's a crime scene and, you know, evidence might be on it and stuff. They try not to contaminate it. However, the sea would have contaminated the body more than their fingerprints would. And so the officers grabbed Tony Davis by the feet and began like dragging his body upwards up the beach to get him away from the tide. And when they did, his jumper rode up and exposed so many stab wounds on his torso. And just like with Keith Randall's, it was very clear that Tony Davies had put up a fight with his murderer. All the pebbles on the beach were displaced and there was blood in like quite a big area, showing that this kind of altercation had moved around a lot. So normally with murders like this, police will ask the family like if they know of anyone that might want to hurt the victim. Of course they did that with this case as well. They do it with every single one because, you know, it could lead to a big lead. However, police with this one were pretty sure that this was a random attack, that this probably wasn't someone that knew Tony Davies or had planned to kill him anyway. The other two, Henry Roberts and Keith Randall's murders, could have easily been planned because they were killed while they were carrying out their daily routine. Henry walked home from the pub every day and Randall's probably walked home from the pub a couple of nights a week. Someone could have easily stalked the other two men, worked out their patterns, and then, you know, figured out a good time to kill them. However, with Tony Davies, he wasn't supposed to be walking along the beach that night. Had Tony's aunt not got injured that day, not broken her leg that day, he wouldn't have been walking along the beach because he wouldn't have gone to see her that evening. It seemed as though Tony Davies was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone was looking to kill someone on the beach that night, and it just happened to be Tony. It's a mystery still to this day why Tony Davies was on the beach, because the beach wasn't on the way to his aunt's house. He didn't have, like, for some reason he parked his car in the car park and then went and walked on this beach. None of his family know why he did that. No one knows why he did that. Maybe he was just stressed and wanted to go for a walk or something. However, this isn't entirely shocking to hear of an attack on Pensand Beach. There'd actually been several in the years before this, very similar attacks on that particular part of beach. The beach itself, but also more specifically the public toilets on the beachfront, because these public toilets, specifically the men's ones, were a very well-known gay hookup place, meeting place. Men would go to the toilets, meet other men in the toilets, and they would hook up there. However, in the past couple of years, there'd been quite a few attacks in those toilets on gay men. And there were rumours among all these young men about who was committing these attacks. The most popular of which was that it was the Man in Black, which is what they called him. The Man in Black was a very tall white man who wore all black, of course, black t-shirt or grey t-shirt, black tie, and normally a black leather jacket. And police did know about several attacks that took place on the beach and in those public toilets. However, they were very aware that there were probably even more attacks that just hadn't been reported. Because like I said, these attacks were taking place in a gay meetup spot, and many young men in the 1990s in a very small town in Wales did not feel comfortable or safe coming out. And so if they were attacked while hooking up with a member of the same sex, they were too scared to go to police and report that in case their family found out that they were gay. And so police were very aware that there were probably more attacks than what they knew about. And don't take this as me accusing Tony Davies of going to cheat on his wife that night. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Like I say, no one knows why he was at the beach that night, and there was obviously no one else there, considering there was only one car in the car park. So it seems unlikely to me that he was going to meet a man. So, I don't know, to me it seems as though he was just going for a walk and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not only that though, but if the Keith Randall's murder was connected to the Tony Davies murder, Keith also wasn't believed to have been gay at the time. Of course, he could have been closeted, but I really don't think he was. However, Henry Roberts, the first murder, was rumoured to have been gay. Although he never came out, he was never officially out, so of course we don't know. But a lot of people in the town did think that he was, which makes a lot of people think that maybe Henry Roberts was the first murder on purpose. Like maybe the murderer knew Henry Roberts from a previous hookup and knew that his daily routine was walking home from the pub every night, and so the murderer was thinking about committing murder for the first time and knew that Henry would have been an easy target. Anyway, going off on a tangent there, I was talking about the attacks on the beach and in the toilets. Now, this Man in Black that would commit these attacks left survivors, of course. He left these men still living. He didn't use any weapons, it was all just with his bare hands. However, they were sexually motivated because after he would attack these people, he would masturbate over them and leave semen at the scene. At least 3 of these victims from the attacks were so brutally beaten that they were lucky to survive. One of them was even left with lasting brain damage that put him in a nursing home for the rest of his life from like his young adulthood. Police couldn't work out whether this attacker, this Man in Black, was attacking people because they were gay, because that didn't seem to be a definite pattern, or if he was just attacking men that were easy to get to. Tony Davies was on the beach alone. Keith Randall's had just gotten into his caravan on a construction site alone. Henry Roberts had returned home drunk and alone. Maybe the attacks on the men in the toilets weren't strictly because they were gay. but maybe because they were closeted and they probably wouldn't tell anyone if they went to hook up with a man, but instead that man attacked them. They wouldn't want to admit that they were going to meet a man for that reason in the first place. Perhaps the man in black was gay himself and he was a part of this community, and so he knew the men that weren't out, and so he would target those ones specifically because he knew that they wouldn't go to the police. But yeah, like I've said a million times, police believe that there were way more attacks than what they actually knew about and that they had officially, reported. And so to try and get around that and to try and get a little bit more information on this man in black, police decided to set up an anonymous call line so that these gay men could call this phone number, give any information that they might have on this man in black, but police didn't have to know who they were. So they could tell these stories about hookups and things like that without having to come out. And suddenly, as soon as that phone line was set up, they had so many more men come forward and say that they'd been attacked by the man in black. One man in particular told police that he had been on Pensarn Beach one day. He was approached by the man in black and they were flirting for a while, and then this man asks the young man if he wants to come back to his house, and this young man says yes. This story might get a little bit confusing, so I'm going to call the caller young man and the murderer the man in black. So the young man and the man in black get in this van together and they go back to the man in black's house, and as soon as they get there, the man in black attacks the young man. The young man luckily manages to escape, and he was, quite frankly, very close to losing his life. He was so brutally beaten. However, he never ended up going to police about this because he wasn't out to his family. But now, finally, in this anonymous call, he was able to give police a description of the van, of the house that he was taken to, a description of the man in black himself. So police followed this young man's directions to this house, and they arrived at a huge white house named Darlington House. And immediately, as soon as they got there, the officers knew that they were on the right track. These police officers recognised Darlington House as belonging to a local business owner named Peter Moore, and Peter Moore very much fit the description of the man in black. He was tall, he was white, he was gay, he always wore black shirts, black ties, black leather jackets, but he wasn't an intimidating man. In fact, he was a very popular, very well-liked man. He was, like I said, a business owner. He owned 4 different old cinemas in the whole of North Wales. And these old cinemas were ones that ran on film, and that kind of industry, the old cinema industry, was dying out in the 90s. And Peter Moore was the one to kind of resurrect that industry in the north of Wales, and everyone loved him for it. It kept like a little bit of classic charm to the area. He was known as a local celebrity. He was very kind, he was friendly, he was easygoing. Peter even set up like a kids club every Saturday morning at the cinema. He would screen like a cartoon film, like a kids film, and parents could bring their children, they'd get free snacks as part of the kids club deal, and all the kids loved him. They used to call him Uncle Pete. He was a very well-respected man in the town, and it seemed unlikely that he would even commit one attack, never mind several attacks and 3 murders. However, as the police were sat outside in their car looking at Darlington House, they began to piece together all the very obvious pieces of evidence that have been in front of their face the whole time. Not only did he fit the description of a tall white man that wore all black clothing and a black leather jacket, he was also rumoured to be gay. He also drove a van. If you remember, a van had been spotted at the first 2 murder scenes. However, police had been unable to track this van or its driver until now. So a few days before Christmas in 1995, police set out to go and arrest Peter Moore based on this kind of circumstantial evidence that they had. He seemed like the most likely suspect, and so police went out to try and find him, and they were going in groups rather than alone or in twos. They were going as full groups of officers because they were scared, because Peter Moore was a potentially very dangerous man that had attacked multiple times. Eventually they found him driving down a road in his van, and so they pulled him over and arrested him, And surprisingly enough, Peter just went with it. He'd never even asked why he was being arrested. He didn't put up any kind of fight. He just let them take him. So while police were taking him to the station for questioning, they also got out other teams of police officers to go and search both his house and his van on the side of the road. And one of the first things they found in his van was like a big gym bag on the passenger seat. And when they looked through this bag, they found a knife. But it doesn't even end there. This knife wasn't just any knife. The knife still had blood on it. But that was just the beginning of the case against Peter Moore. As police began searching his home and looking into him and everything, they found piles upon piles of evidence. But before we get into that, I just want to give a little bit of a background on Peter Moore and his childhood. I'm sorry for that cliffhanger, but it kind of had to be done. So Peter Howard Moore was born on September 14th, 1946 to Ernie and Edith Moore. The family lived in Swansea until Peter was around 10 years old, and then they moved to the north coast of Wales, specifically a place called Kinmel Bay. There, the family ended up building their own house, and it was a huge, gorgeous white house, the biggest in the area at that time, and they named it Darlington House. And that is where Peter would live for the rest of his life. He never moved out of Darlington House. Peter Moore always had a passion for film and cinema and, you know, just making movies. Does that make sense? He would always be filming his family doing very like mundane things like cooking or gardening or whatever. He just loved to like film things and create a film. So it makes sense that he would eventually grow up to resurrect the cinema industry in North Wales. He came from a very wealthy family. The Moores were very wealthy, very highly respected in that area. Like I said, they built their own house and it was the biggest house, or at least one of the biggest houses in that area in North Wales. And psychologists have since said that this gave Peter Moore very early on a sense of superiority, a false sense of superiority. He thought that he was better than every other child at his school because he was richer, he had a bigger house, and he thought it was too good to be friends with the poorer children. And for that exact reason, he never really had many friends growing up. He was quite a loner, although he didn't seem too upset about it because, like I say, he had this superiority complex. He thought he was too good for other people. From a very early age, Peter Moore was quite effeminate, and when he was a child, he probably didn't even know his own sexuality yet, so no one else knew his sexuality, yet his father assumed that he was gay. Not only was this in a very homophobic time, it was like the 50s and 60s, but it was also still illegal at that point to be gay in Britain. And so there was even a lot of internalized homophobia within the gay community itself. Gay men didn't like other gay men. They refused to be gay, even though they were. And Peter's father assumed that his son was gay. From a very, very early age, Peter himself probably didn't even know what his sexuality was at this point, but his father was convinced that he was gay. And he hated Peter for it. He was very homophobic towards him, and there were a lot of rumours of abuse and violence behind closed doors. You have to remember that this was a very respectable family, so they never let that kind of leak into that image. They had to stay the respectable Moore family on the outside, but then on the inside it was rumoured that that was going on. And possibly due to this, or maybe even just due to hormones in general, he was a teenage boy, Peter Moore had occasional violent outbursts. And notice I said the word occasional because I actually don't know how often these were. I don't know if it was an unusually high amount of violent outbursts that would have been worrying, that would have been an early warning sign, or if he just had like a normal amount of violent outbursts. Normal is not the right word to use, but I don't know how to word this. Teenage boys and, you know, just teenagers in general are known for violent outbursts because they don't know how to deal with anger yet. So there's all these hormones going on and they're getting angry about real things for the first time, and teenagers are known to like punch walls or throw things or start fights because they don't know how to deal with that anger inside just yet. So I don't know if that was Peter Moore and it was kind of just, you know, growing up and hormones and every other boy in the 60s would have been doing that same kind of thing, or if it was a genuine red flag that people missed, that he was showing signs of being a genuinely violent person. As Peter grew up, he got more and more into filmmaking. He was really passionate about making these little movies at home by himself, and the star of these films quickly became his mother. He absolutely adored his mother. Naturally, he was more of a mummy's boy because he didn't get on with his father at all. And his mother really was the complete opposite of his father. She absolutely adored Peter. She thought that she couldn't have children because she'd been trying for a long, long time and it just wasn't happening. So then finally, when she was pregnant with Peter, she called him her miracle child, her miracle baby. But she wasn't soft on him by any means. She was still quite strict. She was quite a good mother, from what I have been able to tell in my research. She was just a nice mixture of loving and affectionate and, you know, actually being a mother and being quite strict and teaching him things. It was very much kind of like Norman Bates from Psycho kind of vibes, because he was an absolute mummy's boy, would have done absolutely anything for his mother, and she was quite, not controlling of him, but she definitely could get what she wanted from him if she wanted it, you know what I mean? Like, she could easily manipulate her son because he was so obsessed with her. Moore's parents, like I said, were quite wealthy, and they earned this money from running a hardware shop on the ground floor of Darlington House. They converted the whole bottom of it into like a hardware store where they'd sell like gardening tools and drills and, you know, hardware things. And eventually, as Peter Moore got older, he started working in the shop as well. However, it was mainly Peter's father that ran the whole shop. He was really quite good at running this shop, and so he would barely see his family unless they were working with him, because he'd be in that shop for however many hours a day. He was like the driving force behind the whole thing. Not only was his relationship with his son horrendous, but he also wasn't that affectionate with his wife either, Peter's mother. It wasn't that much of a family. Peter and his mother shared a bond, but it didn't seem as though Peter's father shared a bond with either Peter or his mother. It was like the father was the master of the house and he owned his wife and his son, but he didn't really have any connection to either of them. And it was only made worse when his father would drink, and Ernie Moore would drink a lot. He used to be in the military, so that compared with drinking a lot, like he was quite a tough man, quite a scary man, and he would get rather intimidating when he was drinking. When Peter Moore was in his 40s, his father passed away, leaving him and his mother to live in Darlington House alone and run this hardware shop. And like I said, Ernie was the driving force behind this hardware shop, and without him, people recall it just falling apart. Peter just didn't have what it took to run this shop. He couldn't keep on top of stock. He wasn't a good salesperson. He wasn't able to sell as many units as his father could, and so in a desperate attempt to be able to sell more things, he diversified the stock. So whereas before it used to be a hardware store where they sold particular things, Peter decided to get in a bunch of different things in hopes of someone coming in the shop and at least finding one thing that they needed. So Peter got in like kettles and hats and shirts and stickers. However, the hardware store in Darlington House didn't seem as though it could support the Moore family anymore. And so Peter began setting up different business ventures. He decided to convert one of the upstairs rooms into a disco, and they would have a disco night every week. However, that didn't last too long because the neighbours complained about the noise. He set up like a gas delivery service for people that had run out of gas. He would like take it to them. However, that didn't last too long either. Although in his spare time, Peter was still really, really passionate about filmmaking and cinema and stuff. And so to try and get out of the house a little bit and maybe make friends for the first time in his life, he decided to join a club. And they would go there every week and discuss and watch films, particularly horror films. And there he met a man that owned a local cinema. And back then cinemas were quite like old. It was very typical like film cinemas. So they would literally like take the film and like put it in a thing and project it onto a wall. And this man was saying to Peter like, yeah, I own this cinema, but I don't think it's gonna last much longer. Like the cinema industry's dying out. All these bigger ones are coming up and stuff. And you know, he just didn't expect the business to stay afloat for much longer. And Peter, at this point, didn't have anything else to lose. He was desperately looking for another business venture, and that, mixed with his passion for filmmaking, he couldn't bear to see this cinema, you know, die go under, go bankrupt or whatever. And so Peter Moore bought this cinema from this man and refurbished the whole thing, put new seats in, got new up-to-date fresh films in and everything, and within a matter of weeks this cinema had regular customers again. It was a brand new thing and everyone in the town was really excited. And this led to Peter investing in 3 more cinemas in the area, eventually bringing in 1,200 customers per week into these tiny little independent cinemas, which is huge for the 90s. It wasn't a huge money-making industry. Of course, it cost quite a lot of money to operate these cinemas and to buy all these new films in and stuff like that. But Peter didn't mind. It wasn't a money-making thing for him. Just as long as he could make enough money to live and to keep Darlington House and to support his mother, he was just happy, you know, working in the cinema. However, behind the scenes of all of this, the film screenings, the children's clubs, everything like that, Peter Moore was becoming very lonely. He was a gay man, but he was too scared to come out, and he didn't want to lose his mother's love because that was the only really good thing that he still had in his life, and he was scared that if his mother found out that he was gay, she would stop loving him. And so he kept that to himself, but because he was keeping that to himself, he couldn't get a boyfriend and he couldn't bring men round to the house and he couldn't, you know, start a relationship and start a family and whatever. And all of this kind of frustration about really wanting a relationship but not being able to have one led to him joining other sorts of film groups, if you know what I mean. He really got into X-rated films and BDSM films and things like that. However, the BDSM thing was something that he really struggled to fulfill in his life. So, like, think of it this way. There's this many gay men in the north of Wales. This many of them were out of the closet, and even less of that will have been into the same kind of sexual things that Peter Moore was into. So he really struggled to find someone in real life that had the same kind of interests as him to fulfill this urge. He did manage to find people every now and again, and when he did, he would bring them back to Darlington House when his mother was in bed or when his mother was, you know, doing something his mother couldn't know. And there they would make their own kind of X-rated films. However, he didn't find men very often that were into the same things as him, and so this frustration only built and built, and it was an urge that he just couldn't fulfill. And so he began thinking that if no one was willing to give it to him, he would have to go and take it without consent. And one evening, Peter Moore was walking down the road when he walked past a man who was on his way home from the pub. He was very, very drunk. He was stumbling around the place, and something just came over Peter, and he attacked this man. He started beating him. Peter Moore knocked this man out, so he was like collapsed on the floor, he was unconscious, and then Peter masturbated over his body. And that kind of satisfied that urge for a violent sex life, just for that amount of time. And he finally realised that he could go out and satisfy this urge alone. He didn't have to wait to find a man that was also interested in that kind of thing. And so he started doing this more and more. He would go out to Pensarn Beach and those public toilets on Pensarn Beach and attack men. And then in 1994, so a year before the murders, Peter Moore's mother, Edith, passes away. And while he is, of course, devastated, that's his only friend, his only family member, the only real source of social contact that he has, she is gone. But that also means that he can now live his life authentically. He can be a gay man. He could finally bring men back to the house and do whatever he wanted in the house. He didn't have to hide this anymore. And he was finally living life on his own terms in his 50s. But along with this kind of increased sexual freedom, he was now becoming himself. The violence was also increasing on top of that. He still had that same issue that he couldn't find a partner that was interested in the same things as him. Just because he was out of the closet now didn't mean that everyone else was. So he still struggled to find someone to do these kind of things consensually with him. But at least when he did find them on a rare occasion, he didn't have to hide that. And it just so happened that when his mother passed away, Peter started having several other problems all at the same time. Everything began piling on top of him. He was having financial issues, he almost had to sell one of the cinemas, he had to convert one of them into like a general merchandise shop just to kind of keep money coming in and to stay afloat. He now also had to get used to living in this huge house alone. For the past 50 years, he'd been living with his mother, looking after her. He had someone that loved him there 24/7. But now, it must have felt so empty and so lonely. He didn't have any social contact anymore. And police believe that in order to distract himself from his financial issues and from his loneliness, and in order to give himself some control over his life again, Peter Moore began his killing spree. He began dressing in all black. He would wear a shirt and a black tie and a black leather jacket. That was when that began. And he began attacking men in different places as well. On Pensand Beach, in the toilets, he would attack random men that he would meet on nights out. A lot of them were drunk and they were walking home from the pub or whatever because they were easy targets. They weren't going to fight him back. And up until this point, all of Peter's attacks had been just with his bare hands. He hadn't ever used a weapon. But then in September of 1995, on his birthday, he decided to go out and buy himself a hunting knife. And within days of buying this hunting knife, Peter Moore commits his first murder. However, police now have Peter Moore in custody. They've arrested him, they've found the knife in his car. He seems very suspicious. He fits the description of the man in black, yet he's denying any involvement with these three murders. But during a search of his home, police found plenty of information to connect him with the murders of Tony Davies, Henry Roberts, and Keith Randles. They found Tony Davies' coat hanging up on a hook downstairs in Peter's house, just in the open. They also found a lot of camera footage from the construction site where Keith Randles lived and was murdered. Peter also had a swastika flag in his house that he'd taken from the scene of Henry Roberts' murder. And this was a general theme with Peter Moore. He liked to take trophies from his murders and from his attacks. Even when he would just attack these men on the side of the road, he would like take their wallet or their watch or something like that. And it wasn't even for like monetary gain. He didn't steal the money out of the wallet. He would take genuine like possessions from these people so that he could keep them around and look at them and like relive the attack in his head. When he owned the cinemas, he would often go up to his employees and be like, oh, look what I found when I was cleaning up the cinema. And these employees would be really like annoyed because the amount of times that they've cleaned the cinema and they've never found a watch, they've never found a wallet. His employees just thought he was really lucky for coming across these watches on the floor when they never had. But it turns out that they weren't watches that he'd found on the floor of the cinema. They were the things that he was stealing from his victims, and he was taking them to the cinema and showing them to his employees. So police found a lot of like genuine evidence to connect him to these crimes, but alongside that, they also just found a lot of general BDSM gear, X-rated films. They also found a lot of like German costume gear. He was very clearly a Nazi. Another thing that police noticed as they were searching this house was that there were a lot of blood spatters on the walls of the bedroom. And now, at first, this really concerned them because it seemed as though this was the scene of a murder. But there wasn't enough blood for it to be the scene of a murder. So as they continued looking around his house, they noticed, as part of his like BDSM gear, he had a lot of whips. And these whips had blood on them. So it seemed as though the people that he'd been using them on had bled because they'd used them too hard. And then alongside all this like, you know, violent gear, swastikas everywhere, there was also just a lot of like cuddly toys and blankets and stuff. It seemed like such a weird house to live in. And on top of all of that, his mother had been passed away for about 5 years at this point. His mother's bedroom was still intact. It hadn't been touched, it hadn't been moved, the bed was still made. Anyway, back at the police station, police presented all of the evidence that they had to Peter Moore. They had Tony Davies' coat, they had Henry Roberts' swastika, some camera footage from Keith Randles' caravan, and they just presented it all and they said, look, like, we've got you, you might as well confess. but Peter Moore still denied having any connection to the murders. But then a few days later, in the early hours of the morning, in an unexpected turn of events, Peter Moore requested to have a meeting with police. So he sits down with police at like 3 in the morning, and there he confesses to a bunch of attacks, the 3 murders that they were accusing him of, but also another murder that they hadn't even connected to him yet. But before we talk about this 4th murder, I just want to give you the other 3 that we know about from Peter Moore's point of view, because up until now, they'd just been finding a body. They didn't know like the sequence of events that led up to that. So this is what Peter Moore has said about those. Now, a lot of people theorise that Peter Moore actually knew Henry Roberts prior to the murder. That was the first murder that he committed. And this isn't confirmed. Peter hasn't confirmed it. But a lot of people think with the kind of Nazi memorabilia, and they were both gay men, a lot of people think that maybe Peter knew Henry, knew that he lived alone, knew that he was an alcoholic, knew that he walked home from the pub every night. And so if Peter did know Henry, it seemed as though Henry would have been an easy target for a first murder. Whether Peter knew Henry or not is a mystery. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. However, what Peter did tell police, now this bit is confirmed, Peter said that in the days running up to Henry Roberts' murder, he had been stalking Roberts. He'd been following him home from the pub every single night just to make sure that he was going home alone and that he lived alone and that he was drunk every single night when he was walking home. Just making sure that when he finally did decide to attack him, he'd be able to plan. And that was when this witness had seen the van in Henry Roberts' driveway. That was Peter Moore's van, and Peter was probably parked there just watching him go into his house and making sure that he didn't leave afterwards, just getting his routine down. And then on one particular night, Peter Moore, dressed in all black as he normally did, got in his van and stalked Henry Roberts home from the pub one last time. He parked in the driveway and watched Henry Roberts go down his yard and into his house. And he waited until Henry was in there and he was probably settled, and then Peter came and knocked on the door. When Henry opened the door, Peter didn't even say or do anything. He just began stabbing him. Henry Roberts probably put up the least amount of a fight out of all of the murder victims because he was very, very drunk. Next was the murder of Keith Randalls. Peter Moore again had stalked him home from the pub, watched him go and buy his chips, and watched him walk back to the construction site, waited until he got into his caravan, and then Moore went and knocked on the door. This time, however, he started stabbing him. He didn't say anything to him, and Keith Randalls was putting up way more of a fight than Henry Roberts, and Moore started to panic a little bit. And this time, Peter Moore told police that Randalls was pleading for his life. He was saying, why are you doing this to me? And Peter was saying to him, because I can. As for the 3rd murder of Tony Davies, like I said before, I think Tony was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was just walking along the beach when Peter Moore happened to be there. Maybe he was waiting to kill someone on the beach or at the toilets that day, and he spotted Tony alone and acted. Now, as for the 4th murder, this one actually took place between Henry Roberts and Keith Randalls. So this was actually the 2nd murder that Peter Moore ever committed. Peter told police to get him a map, and when they did, he pointed to a specific place, a specific woods, where he had taken this man, stabbed him to death, and then buried him in a shallow grave. This time it was 28-year-old Edward Carthy, a man that Peter Moore had met at a gay bar some miles away from his house, quite a way away. Peter said that it was Edward that approached him first, and they were talking and flirting and dancing all night until Peter asked him to come back to his house, Darlington House. So they got in Peter's van and they started driving back to Darlington House, but like I said, it was some miles away. This was a long journey. And Edward Carthy actually fell asleep in the van. And at this point, Peter Moore was thinking, there's no point in taking him all the way up to Darlington House just to then try and dispose of the body. So he decided to pull over into a woods on the way home, and just kill him there. But this time, Peter was playing a lot more mind games with his victims than the other ones that he'd committed. Like I said, Edward was asleep in the van, and so Peter locked the doors on the van and then woke up Edward Carthy. And Edward was trying to get out of the van, but of course the doors were locked, and so he was panicking because he couldn't get out. Peter then got out the knife from his side pocket on his car door and began playing with this knife and telling Edward Carthy that he was going to kill him. And the whole time, Edward couldn't get out of the door. Eventually, Peter dragged Edward Carthy out of the van, and just like with the other murders, he began stabbing him, but not in the most efficient places to kill him. He wanted to prolong this murder, just like with the other ones. He would stab him on the arms and on the legs and in the stomach, but never up by the heart where it'd kill him straight away. He then decided to bury Edward Carthy's body just in the woods somewhere in a shallow grave. He then got back in his van, drove back to Darlington House and carried on like nothing had happened. And had Peter Moore not confessed to that fourth murder of Edward Carthy, his body would have probably never been found, and that murder would have never been solved. He would have still been an unsolved disappearance to this day. And I think Peter Moore liked having that power. He liked that he was the one to tell them. Police weren't the one to catch him for that murder, at least. He was the one to give himself up. He kept the control. Everything was about power with Peter Moore, probably because he felt so powerless growing up with his father. A lot of people have theorised that he attacked men because they symbolised his father. And also because his father was homophobic towards him, that made Peter himself internally homophobic, and it made him hate gay men as well, and so a lot of people believe that is why he targeted men. Peter Moore just liked being infamous. He liked being a brutal serial killer, and he would often read articles on himself, and if these journalists ever got anything wrong in the articles, or if they were using the same pictures over and over again, Peter would write to them and say, oh, you got this bit wrong, let me correct you, here's a more up-to-date picture for you. And when the trial began, when Peter was being escorted from the prison to the car and then from the car to the courthouse, he was loving the media attention and all the cameras and all the reporters. He would smile in the pictures and make scary faces. He would hold up his hands in the handcuffs as if it was a trophy. So now police had a lot of evidence, a confession, a very promising suspect. It seemed as though this was going to be a super easy trial. But nothing could be that straightforward for Peter Moore. Nothing could be that straightforward in a true crime case ever, can it? Peter Moore decided to call a second meeting with police, again in the early hours of the morning, which was a power technique for him as well. He wasn't going to do things on police's time, he was going to do things when he wanted. So he called a second meeting with police, and he sat there and he retracted his confession. He said that he never committed any of those 4 murders, and the person that actually did it was his accomplice named Jason. Of course, police had to look into this by law, because if he was telling the truth, there was an uncaught murderer out there. Uncaught? There was a murderer out there that was on the loose. So police had to look into it, but they didn't believe him at all. They knew that he'd done this. There was plenty of evidence to say that he'd done this, but they had to look for this Jason. However, of course, they didn't find a single connection to any Jason. They couldn't even find a connection between Peter and any person called Jason, never mind the murders and a person called Jason. It was a desperate clutch at straws from Peter Moore to just kind of prolong his trial and, I don't know, try and excite the media again. He liked being in control, so... But police believe that Jason was actually inspired by one of Peter Moore's favourite horror films, Friday the 13th, where the main character, or at least the killer in those films, is Jason. It wasn't even a good attempt at trying to throw police off his trail. If you're going to invent a different serial killer that has supposedly committed your murders, make it realistic. Don't name it after a fictional serial killer from a really popular movie. Anyway, the court trial, apart from whatever that was that he just tried to do, the court trial went very smoothly, and it went exactly as expected. Peter Moore was found guilty of all 4 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will be in prison for the rest of his life. And one rather interesting fact about Peter Moore in prison, he actually made a friend, but not just any friend, a serial killer friend. Have you heard of Harold Shipman, the serial killer? Let me know if you want to see a video on Harold Shipman. He was actually nicknamed Dr. Death, or the Angel of Death, because he was a doctor that was a serial killer and killed a lot of patients. And Harold Shipman's victim toll is believed to be anywhere up to 250 victims. So let me know if you want to see that. But yeah, that completes this case. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a big thumbs up down below and subscribe if you want to see some more like this. I do true crime videos like this all the time. Again, thank you so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. If you want to snatch up that amazing deal of 1 month free and 70% off your subscription, make sure you go into the link nordvpn.com/Eleanor and use the code Eleanor at checkout. A huge thank you to all of my channel members. All of the names are on screen right now. If you'd like to become a channel member, you can click the join button under the video if you're on a desktop, or if you can't find the join button, there'll be a link in the description. If you become a channel member, you'll get access to a bunch of extra perks. You get your name on this end screen at the end of all of my videos. You get access to a members only community tab where we talk about the cases. You can suggest cases for me to cover on my channel, and you get your suggestions fast tracked. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to my second channel if you haven't already. I literally posted on there the other day and I really liked that video, but it's kind of not doing that well, so go watch it because I liked it. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Bye! See you later!